Everything the United States Army taught its soldiers about survival was not just a mistake, it was a signed death warrant. Imagine for a moment that you are an elite Green Beret possessing the finest training Fort Bragg can offer. You carry the most advanced weaponry in the world, supported by the entire industrial might of the Pentagon. You land in the suffocating density of the jungle, confident in your superiority, and reach for your radio to coordinate a devastating strike. Suddenly, your own ally stops you with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Why does this inexplicable reaction happen to a highly trained American operative? The answer is brutal in its absolute simplicity. While you were meticulously trained to bring the thunder and suppress the enemy with overwhelming noise, these men were trained to become the silence itself. Today we are exposing the humiliating reality of the Vietnam War that you will never find in official military history books. This is the story of the day a Special Forces commander realized his $1 million training was actually a suicide note wrapped tightly in a patriotic flag. The real assault on American military pride began in Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, in the brutal year of 1967. The humid, sticky air hung over the dense jungle like a heavy, wet blanket. It was saturated with the nauseating smells of rotting vegetation and distant burning refuse. For Captain James Miller, this potent scent was the familiar background of a deadly job he knew much better than his own family. He arrived not merely as an officer, but as a prestigious, arrogant representative of the elite global military establishment. Captain Miller was a proud graduate of the toughest Ranger courses, a seasoned veteran of 3 brutal combat tours in Southeast Asia, and a recognized expert in unconventional warfare. The Pentagon had specifically sent him with a sensitive mission that was simple but dripping with deep institutional arrogance. His strict orders were to inspect the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. His primary task was to understand exactly why this tiny Allied contingent, numbering incredibly fewer than 200 men, was consistently achieving tactical results that entire heavily armed American battalions simply could not match. The confident captain was absolutely certain he would find diligent but entirely provincial students who desperately needed to be shown how a real global superpower fights a modern war. However, what actively awaited him at the muddy edge of the remote landing zone caused him to physically freeze before the helicopter blades even stopped spinning. The heavy transport helicopter touched down on the red earth of the Nui Dat base with a deafening mechanical roar. Whirlwinds of blinding dust, violently kicked up by the spinning rotor blades, stung his clean face like tiny needles. Captain Miller confidently jumped onto the muddy ground, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of his perfectly packed, heavy canvas rucksack. He methodically adjusted his immaculate load-bearing equipment and confidently looked around for the expected military welcoming committee. He naturally anticipated a crisp formation of soldiers, an eager junior officer to render a formal report, or perhaps a small ceremony befitting his rank. After all, he officially represented the most powerful standing army on the entire planet. But instead of a respectful formal reception, he received the freezing cold shower of absolute, unapologetic indifference. At the darkening edge of the dense jungle stood a remarkably small group of silent men, and their wretched overall appearance provoked not professional respect, but an instinctive, overwhelming desire to aggressively check the safety catch on his service rifle. This tense encounter was only the first shocking blow in a cascading series of professional humiliations he would heavily endure. Standing silently before the pristine American officer were not recognizable soldiers in any conventional military sense. These unmoving figures were true, terrifying phantoms of the deep jungle, looking intensely dangerous and wildly unpredictable. Their issued uniforms were incredibly filthy and heavily worn, making it genuinely seem the cheap fabric had completely rotted directly on their thin bodies. The military clothing had bizarrely turned into ragged scraps of an indeterminate gray-green color that blended perfectly with the surrounding dark foliage. On their calloused feet were not regulation-heavy combat boots, but strange, customized, improvised footwear and extremely light canvas shoes. Their gaunt, exhausted faces featured severely hollow cheeks completely covered in a thick, permanent layer of deeply ingrained jungle dirt and dark, unkempt stubble. But the most terrifying physical feature of these Australian operatives was undoubtedly their unblinking eyes. There was absolutely no patriotic military enthusiasm or simple, expected combat fatigue actively visible in them. In those pale, staring eyes resided the absolute icy emptiness of ruthless, highly efficient predators who had long forgotten modern civilized society. They clearly lived solely and violently by the unforgiving, brutal laws of the jungle food chain. Not a single one of these hardened men moved a solitary muscle to offer a respectful military salute to the visiting combat commander. They simply looked at the intensely proud American captain as if he were a brightly colored, incredibly noisy, and completely useless child's toy accidentally dropped into a hungry tiger cage. But the most brutal, immediate attack was directed forcefully at his sensitive sense of smell. As the incredibly loud mechanical noise of the departing helicopter rotors finally faded into the humid distance, the rigid captain was suddenly hit by a suffocating, dense wave of terrible odor. It was distinctly not the familiar, somewhat reassuring mechanical smell of thick diesel fuel or burning gun oil. It was something deeply organic, incredibly thick, and profoundly nauseating that immediately assaulted his senses. This terrible stench strongly resembled a putrid, boiling mixture of cheap fish sauce, fermenting in the tropical heat for days, and human sweat aged without washing for many agonizing weeks. Mixed deeply into this repulsive, gag-inducing stench was the extremely earthy, rich scent of damp soil, rapidly decaying jungle leaves, and something undeniably, horrifyingly feral. The American officer barely managed to successfully suppress a visible facial grimace of intense, overwhelming physical disgust as he stood there in the mud. These fiercely hardened, quiet men absolutely did not smell like proper, highly disciplined soldiers proudly representing a civilized Western nation. They quite literally smelled like the brutal, unforgiving war itself, incredibly dirty, intensely sweaty, and dangerously, fiercely primal. A lone, unsmiling man walked purposefully and directly toward the annoyed American captain. Judging exclusively by the complete and deliberate visual absence of any official rank insignia on his ragged, filthy uniform, this mysterious man could have genuinely been anyone from a lowly, inexperienced private to a highly commanding, respected combat general of the regiment. In standard American special operational units, even the very smallest tactical combat teams were strictly commanded by highly polished, educated officers holding prestigious West Point diplomas. Here, a nameless, entirely unwashed rogue sergeant was casually and disrespectfully approaching a designated, high-ranking Pentagon representative without hesitation. He was approximately 35 years old, and his physical movements were fluid, deliberate, and completely silent on the earth. He completely and utterly ignored the sacred, heavily established military chain of command that Captain Miller held so incredibly dear to his institutional heart. Instead of providing a standard, respectful military greeting, the completely silent, staring sergeant simply handed the confused American a crumpled, intensely dirty sheet of torn paper carelessly ripped from a small, battered notebook. The hastily handwritten text inscribed aggressively on it in thick, indelible pencil was quite short, but every single chosen word struck the deeply proud officer's fragile, inflated ego significantly harder than a sudden physical slap right across the face. What the instantly furious, highly insulted captain quickly read immediately made the hot blood rush angrily to his flushed, burning cheeks. It was a strict, highly offensive list of operational rules written in a deeply condescending tone, usually reserved for mentally deficient basic training recruits. Rule number 1 firmly stated, "Do not open your mouth or make a single sound unless directly addressed." Rule number 2 categorically and aggressively forbade the complete use of any radio communication equipment under any circumstances without a direct, highly explicit order from the patrol commander. Rule number 3 commanded with absolute authority, "Do not make any bodily movements without specifically receiving direct permission from your acting leader." Rule number 4 sounded exactly like a cruel, highly deliberate mockery directed squarely at the highly trained, heavily decorated ranger. It specifically read, "Do not touch any tactical equipment, personal gear, or even the natural green vegetation immediately around you without officially receiving special permission." And the final 5th rule, which systematically and ruthlessly destroyed all of Captain Miller's remaining, deeply cherished officer authority, stated, "Do not question or discuss a single order received, no matter how profoundly absurd or utterly insane it might actively seem at the given moment during this combat patrol." The incredibly proud captain, who had successfully and bravely commanded hundreds of fighting men and meticulously planned highly complex combat operations, was used to strictly giving authoritative orders. His very first, entirely natural and highly aggressive human reaction was to angrily crumple this dirty piece of insulting paper and aggressively throw it directly into the highly insolent man's deeply weathered, unsmiling face. He desperately and passionately wanted to violently put this incredibly arrogant, blatantly disrespectful jungle sergeant firmly and immediately back in his proper, highly subordinate military place before the entire watching squad. But something remarkably profound and deeply chilling in the Australian's incredibly steady, unblinking gaze firmly made the angry, justified words stick painfully and suddenly in his dry throat. There was only a incredibly calm, intensely focused, and almost bored expectation of failure. It was the highly distinct, deeply terrifying look of a hardened survivor who had already seen dozens of such overly confident, incredibly loud American captains arrive here completely full of massive, blinding institutional pride. That chilling, silent look ultimately spoke significantly louder than any shouted, angry reprimand ever possibly could out here. The silent sergeant pointed a highly callous, deeply hardened finger directly at the American's pristine, perfectly packed canvas rucksack and made a sharp, incredibly aggressive cutting gesture that absolutely required no verbal translation as he firmly commanded. "Open it!" Captain Miller reluctantly and slowly complied, unzipping the heavy green canvas with a chaotic, highly uncomfortable mixture of deep operational confusion and burning, intense personal resentment. This highly reluctant action proudly and mistakenly revealed the absolute finest tactical combat equipment the most powerful, incredibly wealthy military-industrial complex on planet Earth could efficiently and predictably provide. Inside the heavy bag lay a magnificent, completely untouched treasure trove of modern, highly civilized soldiering comforts designed strictly for morale. There was powerful, highly engineered chemical insect repellent, meticulously formulated by top military chemists to effectively ward off deadly jungle malaria. There were individually wrapped cakes of heavily scented commercial soap intended for strict hygiene, fresh plastic tubes of artificial mint toothpaste, expensive cartons of premium cigarettes, sweet chewing gum, rich chocolate bars, and instant coffee. It was a completely mobile, highly impressive slice of civilized American comfort brought directly into the dark wilderness. Then, without a single warning word or slight hesitation, the sergeant aggressively began grabbing incredibly large handfuls of the captain's pristine, highly prized supplies and carelessly throwing them directly into a rapidly growing, ruined pile on the wet, filthy red dirt. Nearly half of the highly frustrated Americans' carefully selected, incredibly expensive equipment was ruthlessly and deliberately tossed away exactly like absolute, worthless garbage in a matter of seconds. When the highly insulted Miller finally opened his mouth to angrily and officially protest, the unblinking sergeant sharply and aggressively held up one single dirt-caked finger. The intense sergeant pointed aggressively and directly at the American's completely exposed, highly scrubbed skin, breathed incredibly deeply through his own calloused nose, and then pointed ominously and silently back in the immediate direction of the incredibly deep, looming jungle. The Australian was deeply and profoundly concerned about human scent, an entirely foreign concept which initially made the highly trained Captain Miller almost laugh out loud at the sheer, undeniable tactical absurdity. He expertly and chillingly mimed a deeply hidden Viet Cong enemy soldier actively and intensely sniffing the humid tropical air. Standard American combat soldiers were consistently supplied with commercial chemical soap manufactured exactly to specific, highly unnatural industrial specifications, effectively creating distinctive, entirely artificial fragrances. Strong insect repellent containing deeply harsh laboratory chemicals evaporated incredibly rapidly into the dense, humid air, thoroughly mixing with artificial mint toothpaste and perfumed chemical deodorant. All of these completely common, highly normalized daily products predictably and tragically created exactly what the elite, deeply experienced Viet Cong jungle trackers chillingly and accurately called the deadly American smell, guaranteeing a highly violent ambush from hundreds of yards away. The true nightmare finally began when the small patrol silently stepped out into the unforgiving green hell of the deep jungle. They actively departed the secure perimeter wire at precisely 0400 hours, slipping completely unnoticed into the absolute, suffocating darkness. Captain Miller inherently knew the aggressive, highly standardized rhythm of these elite combat operations perfectly well from his extensive American training. The fundamental, heavily reinforced military doctrine strongly emphasized pure speed, constant forward movement, and overwhelming, aggressive action to successfully locate the enemy. The established American philosophy actively taught soldiers to find the enemy quickly, fix them firmly in place, and systematically destroy them with overwhelming, devastating firepower. This highly aggressive tactical approach had undeniably and proudly won the Second World War for the mighty Allied forces. This core, unyielding philosophy was rigidly taught at every single fundamental level of prestigious American military education and advanced officer training. However, the silent, ghost-like Australians apparently had definitely not read those same rigid, highly celebrated institutional combat textbooks. During the agonizingly tense first hour of their stealthy tactical movement, the incredibly quiet patrol managed to cover a remarkably pathetic distance of approximately 300 meters. A healthy, fully grown American man could easily and casually walk that exact same short distance in a mere 4 minutes on a paved civilian sidewalk back home. Yet 60 long, frustrating minutes completely into the dangerous combat patrol, the highly annoyed captain could incredibly still clearly see the faint, glowing perimeter lights of the Nui Dat base actively shining directly behind him. The incredibly focused Australians deliberately moved with an agonizing, almost hypnotic slowness, with each hardened man meticulously placing his canvas-clad feet exactly like a highly trained surgeon, making a critical, life-saving bodily incision. They absolutely did not aggressively and noisily push their heavy bodies directly through the thick, resistant jungle vegetation. Instead, they fluidly and silently flowed entirely around it, expertly finding natural, hidden paths that quietly opened for them, and then seamlessly and completely closed silently right behind their passing, ghost-like physical forms. Every few tense, sweating minutes, the entire heavily armed combat patrol completely and utterly froze in place without a single spoken command. They did not merely slow their cautious pace down, they absolutely froze into complete, rigid immobility. This terrifying, statue-like stillness would last anywhere from 30 agonizing seconds to 10 incredibly long, excruciating minutes. The highly disciplined Australians incredibly seemed to entirely stop breathing during these tense moments, seamlessly and magically becoming entirely visually indistinguishable from the ancient, massive hardwood trees heavily surrounding them. The highly trained American officers' deep internal operational frustration was rapidly and dangerously building toward a massive, explosive psychological breaking point. By 0600 hours, they had only managed to cover perhaps 500 total meters of dense, unforgiving jungle terrain. His rigid, highly structured institutional training loudly screamed directly into his mind that they were foolishly and carelessly wasting the valuable tactical cover of night darkness. He truly believed they were needlessly surrendering the critical operational initiative and generously allowing the hidden enemy crucial time to prepare. Captain Miller genuinely believed that a quiet, highly professional word to the strange patrol commander would certainly be perfectly acceptable to efficiently get things moving faster. He leaned closely toward the unsmiling sergeant and softly whispered that they desperately needed to significantly increase their tactical pace to successfully reach the designated military objective. The intensely hardened sergeant's physical response was absolutely immediate, entirely silent, and profoundly, brutally humiliating. Without even turning his dirty face, he sharply extended his arm downward, forcefully pressing his open palm directly toward the muddy earth. That single, incredibly sharp hand gesture clearly and violently commanded the highly decorated American officer to immediately sit down, remain completely silent, and simply wait obediently. This incredibly dismissive, highly arrogant physical action instantly and completely reduced a proud, heavily trained United States Army captain directly to the pathetic, highly humiliating status of a disobedient, completely clueless little child acting up inappropriately inside a quiet public library. The deep, burning shame of that incredibly brief, silent physical encounter would deeply haunt his professional pride for many years. The third critical, deeply terrifying survival lesson forcefully struck the frustrated captain as something even more profoundly personal than mere operational battlefield tactics. As the dark, heavy jungle nightfall rapidly approached, The nervous American officer naturally expected to finally establish routine, secure radio communication directly with the distant Allied headquarters. Rigid American military doctrine strictly and absolutely required regular, highly detailed situation reports from the field. Missing one scheduled transmission was considered serious. Missing two immediately triggered extreme operational concern back at the base. Missing three consecutive scheduled radio calls always automatically launched a massive, heavily armed search and rescue military operation into the dangerous jungle. Desperately needing the warm, psychological comfort of a friendly, familiar American voice, Miller confidently reached down for the heavy plastic handset of his advanced communication radio. He instantly found the dirty, incredibly calloused hand of the silent Australian sergeant aggressively and firmly stopping his movement once again. The incredibly tight physical grip felt exactly like cold, unforgiving iron wrapped tightly around his wrist. The Australian's pale, intensely cold blue eyes clearly and aggressively conveyed a terrifying, unspoken message that absolutely required no verbal translation. The sergeant deliberately and slowly drew a single dirty finger straight across his own sweaty throat, clearly indicating that any radio transmission immediately equaled a violent, inescapable death. The frustrated American desperately wanted to angrily argue that modern military encryption made enemy intercepts nearly impossible, proudly believing American communication equipment was absolutely the most secure and highly advanced technology in the entire world. However, the terrified captain suddenly and painfully remembered the strict, highly humiliating rules previously handed to him, firmly demanding absolutely no questioning of any given orders. He watched in complete, horrified disbelief as the silent Australians expertly established their hidden night defensive position without transmitting a single spoken word back to base. He would later brutally learn that elite Viet Cong signals intelligence had become extraordinarily sophisticated, incredibly deadly, and highly efficient by that year. They possessed captured American radio equipment and thoroughly studied standard operating procedures. The highly intelligent enemy trackers absolutely knew that heavily armed American combat patrols predictably transmitted regular, highly scheduled radio reports at the exact same time. They had brilliantly developed highly effective radio triangulation techniques that precisely located isolated Allied patrols within mere minutes of a single broadcast. The enemy's strategy brilliantly exploited rigid American radio discipline by simply waiting for the scheduled report, rapidly triangulating the exact jungle position, moving deadly ambush elements silently into place, and springing the violent trap upon the next confirmed transmission. The stubborn Pentagon leadership absolutely knew about this devastating, highly fatal vulnerability, but changing massive institutional military procedures proved entirely too politically difficult. The Australian operatives fully accepted the cold, hard reality that absolute silence was significantly more valuable than any tactical coordination. The undeniable, brutal statistics proved that Australian forces suffered dramatically fewer tragic losses to unexpected enemy ambushes. Captain Miller lay absolutely terrified in the suffocating dark, slowly realizing his advanced radio lifeline was actually a deadly leash held tightly by the waiting enemy. The morning of the fourth agonizing day brought with it a truly suffocating, unbearable tropical heat. It completely seemed to dangerously rise not from the blazing sun, which remained entirely hidden behind the massive, towering triple canopy of the dark jungle, but directly from the boiling core of the earth itself. The incredibly exhausted patrol had been meticulously and silently moving for 2 incredibly long, punishing hours. They stubbornly maintained that extremely frustrating, agonizingly slow-motion tactical pace that Captain Miller had desperately come to violently detest, yet grudgingly and slowly begun to deeply respect for its sheer discipline. Every single highly trained muscle in his aching American body burned fiercely from the completely unnatural, exhausting physical tension of deliberately placing each heavy canvas boot with absolute, surgical precision. The surrounding jungle silence was incredibly profound and absolute, only occasionally and quietly broken by the steady, rhythmic dripping of warm morning condensation falling from giant green fern leaves. Distantly, the highly mocking, sharp call of a wild gibbon echoed through the thick, humid air. The extremely frustrated captain was profoundly dehydrated, mentally exhausted, and entirely stripped of every civilized comfort he had ever known as a privileged officer. But the absolute, ultimate psychological test of his rapidly fraying American sanity was just about to terrifyingly begin in the deep undergrowth. The highly experienced Australian point man, a remarkably lanky soldier with dark camouflage paint, streaked fiercely across a hardened face that genuinely looked heavily carved from solid granite, suddenly and completely froze. It was absolutely not the casual, relaxed stop of an exhausted man finally taking a quick break. It was the terrifying, statue-like immobility of an apex predator that has instantly sensed a highly dangerous, unexpected shift in the humid tropical wind blowing through the ancient trees. Slowly, with an agonizingly deliberate and highly controlled physical motion, the hardened point man carefully raised a tightly clenched, dirty fist into the humid air. The urgent tactical signal quickly and silently rippled directly down the tense patrol line, clearly commanding them to instantly halt, absolutely freeze, and completely vanish into the surrounding environment. Captain Miller immediately sank deep into the foul, rotting jungle vegetation, desperately pressing his trembling body directly into the wet red mud. He stayed there until he painfully felt the terrible, freezing cold dampness completely soak through his previously immaculate, highly regulated American military uniform. He desperately attempted to seamlessly merge his entire physical form directly with the massive, twisting roots of an ancient, towering teak tree. His panicked heart hammered aggressively against his aching ribs, exactly like a desperately trapped bird, for 5 incredibly long, terrifyingly silent minutes. There was absolutely nothing visible, no sudden sound, no aggressive movement, just the maddening, high-pitched buzzing of hungry jungle mosquitoes swarming directly around his highly sensitive ears. Because he was strictly forbidden to aggressively swat the biting insects, he quickly began to seriously doubt if the silent point man had merely imagined the unseen threat. And then, with absolutely terrifying suddenness, he finally saw the approaching deadly threat clearly. They silently and confidently emerged directly from the solid green wall of the dense jungle, exactly like heavily armed ghosts magically materializing from thick, gray smoke. This was absolutely not a lost, stray reconnaissance patrol or a poorly equipped, ragged band of local amateur guerrillas blindly wandering the woods. This was a highly organized, deeply terrifying main force military unit composed entirely of hardened, highly trained North Vietnamese regular combat soldiers actively moving along a deeply hidden, heavily concealed tactical supply trail. Their heavily concealed path dangerously intersected the completely hidden Australian patrol's current tactical route at a perfect 90-degree angle, astonishingly less than 40 incredibly short meters away. The terrified American captain's widening eyes desperately began to rapidly count the heavily armed approaching enemy soldiers, his racing, highly trained mind instantly making complex, professional military calculations. He silently counted 4 hardened men, then 8, then 12, 16, 20, and finally 24 heavily equipped combatants continuously stepping directly into his terrifyingly narrow field of vision. This terrifyingly massive, highly disciplined enemy formation was absolutely a heavily reinforced, highly dangerous frontline platoon. They were incredibly heavily armed, and their advanced Soviet military equipment was visibly maintained in absolutely pristine, highly functional combat condition. The intensely focused Miller clearly saw the highly distinctive, deadly curved metal magazines of numerous loaded assault rifles tightly gripped in their hands. He also clearly saw the highly menacing, dull iron gleam of deadly rocket launchers casually carried heavily upon strong shoulders, alongside terrifyingly destructive light machine guns equipped with massive, heavy ammunition drums. These intensely focused men were absolutely not simple, peaceful rural farmers desperately attempting to protect their small, isolated village rice paddies. These fiercely dedicated enemy fighters were highly experienced, incredibly dangerous shock troops moving with a terrifying, absolute confidence that instantly chilled the hiding American captain's racing blood. They absolutely did not fearfully whisper in the dark, and they absolutely did not nervously creep through the dense underbrush. They confidently and proudly walked upright directly through the hostile environment, exactly as if they completely owned the entire surrounding jungle. The highly trained American captain's deeply ingrained, institutional combat training instantly and violently kicked into his mind with the absolutely overwhelming, unstoppable psychological force of a massive ocean wave. Every single trained firing neuron in his highly conditioned brain, every single rigid academic lecture he had eagerly attended at his prestigious military academy, violently screamed one single tactical word: ambush. The immediate, unfolding tactical situation before him was absolutely, undeniably perfect in every single conceivable military aspect. It was exactly the specific, highly idealized kind of textbook combat setup that ambitious, highly aggressive American combat officers desperately dreamed of encountering during their entire professional military careers. The heavily armed enemy was casually moving directly across their immediate hidden front, completely exposing their highly vulnerable flank. This incredible, completely unexpected situation was the absolute, classic textbook scenario for a highly devastating, utterly destructive L-shaped infantry ambush. His entirely invisible, deeply concealed Allied patrol was perfectly positioned inside the incredibly dense, protective jungle cover, while the entirely clueless enemy force remained terribly exposed in the immediate open. The terrifyingly short combat range was essentially point blank, absolutely no more than 40 meters, separating the highly trained opposing forces. At this incredibly close distance, the devastating, high-velocity metal rounds of their modern automatic rifles would instantly tear directly through the completely surprised enemy combat ranks. His nervous, highly eager trigger finger unconsciously twitched directly toward the heavy metal safety selector switch of his loaded assault rifle. His deeply conditioned, highly aggressive military mind was already proudly writing the highly triumphant, heavily decorated official after-action combat report for his commanding generals. He enthusiastically envisioned a prestigious, shiny Silver Star medal being proudly pinned directly to his immaculate dress uniform chest for decisively winning this incredibly violent, sudden jungle battle. He desperately and eagerly looked directly at the hardened, silent Australian sergeant, completely expecting to rapidly receive the aggressive, highly anticipated tactical signal. He fully expected to finally see the deeply experienced Australian aggressively deploying his hidden men, rapidly shifting their deadly arcs of fire, and eagerly preparing to unleash absolute, unholy hell upon the exposed enemy. What the highly eager American captain actually saw, instead completely and instantly stopped his racing, terrified heart cold in his chest. The intensely focused, deeply hardened sergeant was absolutely not moving a single, solitary muscle in his entirely rigid, mud-covered body. He was absolutely not aggressively shifting his heavy weapon, and he was completely and utterly ignoring the highly furious officer. He was simply and incredibly calmly watching the heavily armed enemy column slowly pass by their incredibly vulnerable, deeply hidden jungle position. His intensely cold, pale blue eyes were entirely locked directly onto the moving enemy column, silently tracking their steady progress with the entirely detached, highly analytical interest of a dedicated scientist observing ants. There was absolutely no aggressive, violent military intent visible anywhere in his incredibly relaxed, entirely silent physical posture, only an absolute, terrifying stillness. The fiercely angry captain leaned incredibly close and violently hissed that they were being complete cowards for entirely missing this kill. The hardened sergeant slowly turned his dirty face toward the furious officer and coldly whispered back that firing a single rifle shot would instantly bring down a massive, inescapable rain of deadly enemy mortar fire upon their heads. In the rigid, highly aggressive American military culture, completely letting a massive, highly exposed enemy platoon simply walk away unharmed looked exactly like terrible weakness, hesitation, and absolute failure. But the completely silent, deeply pragmatic Australians were absolutely not desperately hunting for meaningless, bloody trophies, brilliantly viewing the living, breathing enemy strictly as highly valuable, deeply strategic military information to be exploited. The agonizing jungle patrol completely held their deeply concealed, entirely invisible tactical position, silently and helplessly watching the massive enemy military column slowly and confidently fade away. They completely allowed the heavily armed North Vietnamese soldiers to aggressively carry their dangerous, highly lethal military secrets directly south toward the vulnerable American fire bases. But the cruel, intensely unforgiving tropical jungle environment was absolutely not finished brutally testing the entirely exhausted, highly frustrated American combat officer, not even remarkably close to being finished with him yet. Exactly 2 incredibly tense, entirely silent hours later during the agonizing patrol, the entire psychological mood of the surrounding green jungle drastically and terrifyingly shifted, and it physically shifted incredibly fast, completely altering the immediate, suffocating atmospheric tension. The thick, humid tropical air instantly felt profoundly wrong and deeply menacing to the highly trained soldiers. The previously noisy, brightly colored wild jungle birds completely and suddenly went entirely quiet, creating a highly unnatural, deeply terrifying silence that immediately indicated a very close, highly aggressive human presence. The intensely focused, deeply experienced Australian patrol sergeant instantly and silently halted the moving line of hardened men with an incredibly small, highly sharp physical hand signal. This incredibly precise, deeply subtle physical gesture perfectly and instantly carried the absolute terrifying meaning of immediate mortal danger without requiring a single spoken noisy word. The highly urgent, entirely unspoken tactical message, rapidly passed down the tense line, was incredibly simple but deeply horrifying. Someone extremely dangerous was actively and silently following right behind their current position. They were absolutely and undeniably being heavily and expertly tracked through the dense, unforgiving jungle foliage by highly skilled, entirely unseen enemy combatants. For the highly decorated, rigidly trained American captain, that incredibly terrifying, deeply claustrophobic tactical idea was an absolute, unmitigated psychological nightmare of the highest order. In standard American military doctrine, a heavily tracked infantry patrol is essentially an entirely trapped, completely doomed patrol desperately waiting to be violently and systematically slaughtered. The entirely normal, deeply ingrained American impulse in this specific situation was immediate speed. The highly conventional American combat doctrine fiercely demanded aggressively putting massive physical distance between the patrol and the hidden trackers, followed immediately by a desperate, panicked radio call for heavy air support. But there was absolutely no frantic, panicked sprinting permitted here in this suffocating green hell, and there was absolutely no magical radio lifeline available to call for massive, explosive rescue. The fiercely silent Australians deliberately and carefully did something significantly colder, profoundly stranger, and infinitely more terrifying to the heavily conditioned American officer's mind. They entirely and completely turned their tired, heavily armed bodies directly back toward the massive, impending mortal danger, rapidly approaching them from the dark jungle shadows. They expertly and silently executed an incredibly tight, highly disciplined tactical loop, a classic, deeply dangerous combat maneuver professionally known as the defensive button hook. They began moving incredibly quietly, perfectly parallel to their very own freshly made trail, and rapidly cutting deeply into the surrounding thick vegetation to expertly and completely overlook the exact same muddy path they had just walked. It was an absolute, completely undeniable act of sheer, cold-blooded tactical nerve that genuinely felt utterly insane to the terrified, heavily sweating American Special Forces officer. Because this entirely counterintuitive, incredibly dangerous tactical movement meant actively and deliberately choosing to physically face the approaching, highly lethal hunter rather than frantically and desperately running completely away from him. They silently and seamlessly settled deeply into the foul, rotting jungle leaves, carefully keeping their loaded weapon muzzles perfectly and steadily covering their own freshly made, highly visible muddy footprints. Their completely flattened, entirely rigid physical bodies seamlessly merged into the damp, dark earth. Their heavy, exhausted breathing deliberately and significantly slowed to an absolute, imperceptible crawl. Their intensely cold, deeply focused predator eyes remained incredibly steady and entirely unblinking as the agonizing, deeply terrifying minutes slowly and painfully dragged on. Heavy, incredibly salty tropical sweat slowly crawled directly down their painted, deeply grimacing faces, completely ignored by the highly disciplined, entirely motionless men. Annoying, highly persistent jungle insects frequently landed heavily on their completely exposed skin and stayed. Absolutely no one in the highly disciplined, deeply concealed Australian patrol moved a single, solitary physical muscle as they silently and patiently waited for the unseen enemy to finally arrive. Then, incredibly quietly, three distinctly dark, entirely silent human figures slowly and carefully appeared, stepping incredibly softly directly into the narrow, muddy corridor of the patrol's very own footprints. They entered the highly dangerous, completely exposed jungle pathway, exactly like highly experienced, deeply professional craftsmen, confidently and cautiously entering their very own, highly familiar daily workshop. These incredibly quiet, deeply focused men were absolutely not ordinary, poorly trained enemy riflemen casually wandering through the dense, highly unforgiving tropical jungle environment. These heavily armed, intensely concentrated enemy soldiers were elite, deeply experienced Viet Cong jungle trackers, hardened men specifically and highly trained to expertly read slightly bent green grass and incredibly tiny broken twigs, as if the ancient, silent jungle itself were actively and continuously writing a highly detailed, deeply explicit written confession. They expertly and slowly moved with their dark eyes permanently fixed on the muddy earth. They were intensely and continuously scanning the damp jungle floor for incredibly minute physical pressure points and highly subtle, nearly invisible artificial patterns deliberately left behind by heavy combat boots. They were expertly and silently following the completely invisible ghost of the heavily armed Australian patrol with an incredibly calm, deeply terrifying, professional certainty that deeply chilled the American officer's blood. One intensely focused enemy tracker completely paused his slow, deliberate movement incredibly close to the completely paralyzed, heavily sweating Captain Miller's deeply concealed, entirely flattened physical body. He was standing incredibly close enough for the terrified American officer to actually see the individual sweaty pores entirely covering his dark, highly weathered facial skin and the thick, black grime deeply wedged entirely under his dirty fingernails. The highly dangerous enemy tracker carefully and deeply studied a very tiny, incredibly faint muddy mark completely left behind in the wet soil, slowly shifted his heavy body weight, and deliberately leaned intensely forward, as if the ultimate answer was merely inches away. Miller's dry throat tightened instantly and painfully. A single, incredibly tiny suppressed cough, a single careless, slightly heavy human breath, and the entire heavily armed Allied patrol would be instantly and violently pinned down in a massive, inescapable killing box. But the incredibly disciplined, deeply hardened Australians absolutely did not twitch a single muscle or rapidly draw a noisy, panicked breath during this highly terrifying, incredibly intimate encounter. They completely and utterly waited the highly skilled, deeply dangerous enemy trackers out with absolute, perfectly executed psychological dominance and completely unparalleled physical restraint in the damp jungle. They entirely allowed the completely oblivious enemy trackers to deeply and intensely stare directly at the highly visible muddy trail, quickly confer in incredibly small, entirely silent physical gestures, and ultimately move confidently onward. The highly lethal enemy tracking team completely and truly believed their heavily armed, deeply exhausted human quarry was still frantically running far ahead of their current, immediate jungle position. The highly outnumbered Australian patrol did absolutely not desperately escape so much as it completely and brilliantly rewired the entire, highly deadly tactical situation. The highly dangerous, heavily armed enemy hunters had been entirely, completely, and expertly handled, physically redirected, and thoroughly, profoundly humiliated without a single, incredibly noisy rifle shot ever being wildly fired. And that was the absolute, precisely defined moment that the highly decorated Captain Miller finally and completely understood the deeply sick, incredibly ironic cosmic joke of American military training. In this deeply unforgiving, entirely brutal tropical jungle, the incredibly loud, highly aggressive, and extremely confident man is completely and undeniably always the very first tragic combat victim. The highly impatient, rigidly trained American combat soldier is absolutely always the entirely clueless, heavily bleeding victim in this highly terrifying, completely silent environment. The proud, highly decorated man who desperately needs to continuously and aggressively prove something to his distant commanding generals is absolutely the completely doomed, entirely tragic victim. The intensely quiet, deeply disciplined Australians absolutely did not effectively survive by being traditionally, aggressively brave in the highly celebrated, deeply flawed American military sense that continuously demanded massive, overwhelming firepower and incredibly noisy, highly visible dominance. They efficiently and consistently survived the incredibly deadly, entirely unforgiving tropical combat environment by being absolutely, completely, and deeply unbearable in their sheer, unyielding psychological and physical operational discipline. They brilliantly and coldly utilized the absolute, highly terrifying silence as their primary, most devastating tactical weapon against a deeply native enemy force completely accustomed to fighting incredibly loud, highly aggressive American units. But the ultimate, highly explosive final combat test of his deeply shattered American sanity was rapidly approaching, and it would absolutely not be quiet or peaceful. Late in the agonizing day, the heavily exhausted combat patrol desperately pushed directly into a massive, blinding patch of towering green elephant grass. This incredibly thick, highly dangerous jungle vegetation aggressively rose significantly high enough to completely and utterly swallow grown men entirely whole. The absolute, critical combat visibility instantly and terrifyingly collapsed to a mere physical arm's length in every single conceivable direction. Every single cautious, heavy step genuinely felt exactly like blindly walking directly through a dark, suffocating green tunnel with unseen, ghostly hands violently reaching directly from the hidden, shadowy sides. It was absolutely the most terrifying, worst possible tactical terrain for an unexpected, highly violent meeting engagement with the hidden enemy forces. And in the brutal, deeply unforgiving reality of the Vietnam War, these sudden, blind jungle collisions absolutely had a terrible, highly predictable habit of instantly turning into massive, bloody tragedies. It terrifyingly happened in a single, violently explosive instant that entirely shattered the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep jungle. Dark, heavily armed human figures suddenly and incredibly closely appeared directly ahead in the incredibly thick, blinding green grass. The completely surprised enemy combatants were standing incredibly close enough for the terrified American officer to clearly see their shocked, sweating faces before his highly conditioned military brain could even properly process the immediate mortal danger. The profound, freezing shock of this sudden, highly intimate jungle encounter was entirely mutual between the two heavily armed opposing forces. There was a terrifying fraction of a second of absolute paralyzing disbelief where both highly trained sides suddenly realized they had completely and entirely wandered directly into each other's highly lethal, waiting jaws. Captain Miller's highly aggressive, rigidly trained American combat instincts instantly and violently surged, desperately demanding a heavily reinforced, completely static defensive posture. His deeply ingrained military mind aggressively demanded rapidly establishing a solid firing line and fiercely demanding a heavily fortified position to stubbornly hold against the sudden, unexpected enemy assault. The highly standard, heavily celebrated American infantry response was to aggressively hold the valuable ground, firmly fix the exposed enemy in place with overwhelming firepower, and desperately call the distant cavalry for massive, explosive airborne assistance. But the intensely focused, deeply hardened Australians absolutely did not rapidly dig in or desperately attempt to aggressively hold the highly dangerous, completely exposed jungle ground. They absolutely did not frantically look around for any protective tactical cover in the blinding green maze. Instead, they completely and utterly detonated. Shoot and scoot. Go, go, go. The intensely focused sergeant's highly urgent, incredibly loud voice violently cut directly through the thick, humid air. What incredibly happened next was an absolute, terrifying display of highly controlled, deeply violent tactical chaos that entirely defied physics. All 5 deeply experienced Australian operatives completely and simultaneously opened heavy, devastating automatic fire directly into the thick, blinding elephant grass. But they absolutely didn't meticulously aim their heavy weapons, and they entirely didn't attempt to carefully pick out individual, heavily armed human targets in the green chaos. They simply and aggressively leveled their powerful, heavy-caliber rifles precisely at waist height and completely emptied their fully loaded metal magazines in one single, continuous, and absolutely deafening, terrifying roar. The heavy, high-velocity rounds violently tore directly through the thick jungle vegetation. The massive, incredibly destructive storm of flying hot lead ruthlessly and systematically shredded the thick green vegetation and the completely surprised, highly vulnerable human flesh entirely alike. It was an absolute, completely impenetrable, highly lethal solid wall of flying metal. The resulting, deafening mechanical noise of the sudden engagement was completely and entirely indescribable to the highly shocked American officer. It absolutely wasn't the standard, highly predictable popping sound of a typical infantry firefight. It was a solid, highly physical wall of concussive sound that aggressively slammed directly into Miller's chest. The deeply shocked, highly vulnerable Viet Cong tracking patrol absolutely didn't stand a single, miserable chance of successfully returning any accurate, deadly fire. They were completely and utterly overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying volume of heavy lead violently coming directly their way through the blinding green grass. They desperately and frantically violently dove directly for the muddy ground, absolutely terrified and entirely convinced they had tragically and accidentally walked directly into an entire, heavily armed company of incredibly desperate, highly aggressive American fighting men looking for a massive bloodbath. They desperately kept their terrified, sweating heads entirely down, blindly and frantically spraying highly inaccurate, completely ineffective automatic fire directly into the humid tropical air, desperately praying for simple survival. The highly energized, deeply terrified Captain Miller was enthusiastically firing too, his heavy American assault rifle violently chattering as massive amounts of pure adrenaline completely flooded his nervous system. He was highly eager and absolutely ready to rapidly reload, aggressively throw a highly explosive fragmentation grenade, and violently charge forward to finally and decisively finish the pinned enemy off entirely. And then, absolutely abruptly, the incredibly deafening, highly violent Australian automatic fire completely and utterly stopped. The highly confused Captain Miller rapidly turned around, fully expecting to eagerly see his hardened combat allies rapidly reloading their heavy weapons, but the muddy space directly beside him was completely and entirely empty. The highly disciplined Australians were completely gone. They absolutely hadn't bravely held the static firing line, and they completely hadn't aggressively advanced toward the highly vulnerable, pinned enemy force. They had entirely, completely, and magically vanished into the deep jungle. The highly panicked American officer violently spun around and incredibly saw them sprinting rapidly back down the narrow, highly concealed jungle trail. They were silently moving with an absolute terrifying speed that genuinely seemed completely impossible for exhausted men heavily carrying massive, fully loaded canvas packs. They were expertly and flawlessly executing the highly critical scoot portion of the deeply unorthodox tactical maneuver. "Move, Yank, move!" The intensely focused sergeant loudly yelled from 20 meters back, frantically and aggressively waving his calloused hand to urge the highly confused officer forward. Captain Miller desperately and frantically scrambled to his entirely numb feet, his highly trained, rigidly conditioned military mind completely and utterly reeling in pure, undeniable shock. He frantically thought that they were completely winning the violent engagement, that they had the heavily armed enemy entirely pinned down in the mud. So why on earth were they running away like entirely terrified, deeply cowardly children? It genuinely felt profoundly wrong. It felt deeply and terribly shameful, and it completely felt exactly like a massive, highly humiliating military rout to the proud officer. But the highly terrified American captain desperately ran anyway. He frantically ran through the dense jungle until his heavy, exhausted lungs burned exactly like hot, searing fire in his chest. He desperately ran until the incredibly salty, heavy tropical sweat completely and utterly blinded his frantic, searching eyes. He aggressively ran past the sharp, tearing green vines that violently ripped his pristine uniform, completely past his very own deeply ingrained, highly physical limits of absolute human endurance. The intensely focused Australians fluidly moved exactly like rapidly flowing, entirely silent water. They expertly and seamlessly navigated the dangerous jungle, never completely stopping their rapid tactical movement and absolutely never looking back at the highly confused enemy. After a massive, lung-burning sprint of 500 meters, they abruptly stopped, silently dropping directly into a highly secure, deeply concealed defensive perimeter entirely hidden inside a massive thicket of strong bamboo. The heavy, deeply gasping silence slowly returned to the dark jungle. Miller completely collapsed against a massive tree, fiercely wheezing and entirely ready to angrily demand a formal explanation for this complete, highly shameful cowardice. "Listen," the intensely focused Australian sergeant violently hissed, aggressively holding up a single, highly calloused, dirt-covered hand. The highly exhausted Captain Miller desperately held his burning breath. From incredibly far back down the trail, exactly where they had just violently made unexpected contact, suddenly came the highly terrifying, deeply concussive sound of massive modern war. The heavy, distinctive thumping sound of incoming high-explosive mortar rounds violently and repeatedly landing in the empty elephant grass loudly shattered the calm jungle silence, instantly followed by the incredibly rapid chatter of heavy machine guns. The highly organized, deeply deadly Viet Cong reinforcement forces were absolutely and systematically hammering the entirely abandoned contact site with massive, overwhelming explosive firepower. "You hear that?" the intensely calm sergeant quietly whispered, a highly grim, deeply knowing smile briefly touching his chapped lips. "If we had stayed there for just 2 single minutes to bravely fight it out, we would absolutely be dying under that massive mortar barrage right now." The highly shocked American officer instantly felt all the warm blood completely drain from his completely stunned, terrified face. The deeply brilliant, entirely unorthodox tactical philosophy completely stated that the absolutely only fair combat fight is the exact one you wisely walk entirely away from. The intensely relieved, highly changed American captain finally returned safely to the massive Allied military base, his rigid, highly aggressive military mindset completely and entirely rewritten by the brutal jungle reality. He quickly and honestly submitted a massive, highly detailed 47-page official military report, explicitly detailing the incredible, life-saving importance of absolute silence, advanced scent control, and the complete tactical avoidance of unnecessary, highly dangerous combat. But massive, highly rigid military institutions absolutely despise facing deep, humiliating professional truths. The highly arrogant, entirely stubborn Pentagon leadership deliberately buried his brilliant, life-saving report, entirely preferring deeply comforting, entirely false enemy body counts over adopting strange, highly unconventional survival tactics. The deeply profound, absolute truth entirely remained hidden inside the dark, unforgiving tropical jungle. Ultimate survival strictly and exclusively belongs solely to the intensely quiet, the incredibly patient, and the entirely ruthless. The highly disciplined Australian phantoms completely understood that absolute silence is absolutely the most devastating weapon.